What do you do when you're the only working food source for 6 blocks in every direction and someone with numbers and weapons decides the roof belongs to them? The tomato plant comes out of the bed roots first when I drag it clear. I don't want to pull it. I've been nursing this row of Roma since late March, and it's the middle of August, and 6 of the fruit are almost red, still clinging to a vine that the man lying on top of it has crushed flat. His name was Ray Dunbar. I found that out from a laminated work badge clipped to his jacket. Property inspector. He had a .22 caliber semi-automatic on him with a suppressor threaded to the barrel, 40 rounds in a canvas pouch on his belt, and a folded city map in his inner jacket pocket, with 6 rooftops circled in red marker. He came up the stairwell of this building sometime last Thursday, and he made it as far as the 3rd floor landing before something on that floor stopped him. I wasn't there when it happened. I was up here on the roof. I heard a sound from below, not much of one, and by the time I went down to check, he was 2 flights up the stairs, having made it that far on his own. He was still warm when I found him. I took the rifle and the rounds and the map. I took his boots too, because my left sole had split along the seam and was only getting worse. I'm not proud of that part. He was past needing boots. I moved him out of the stairwell on Friday because the heat was accelerating things and the smell was starting to push through the gap in the ventilation cover. I got him onto the roof and left him against the parapet wall on the east side with a tarp over him and 2 cinder blocks on the corners to weight it. At some point during the night, the wind took the tarp and the weight shifted and he rolled into the planting bed. Now it's 5:30 in the morning. The wind is still coming in hard, gusts off the sound, and I'm crouching in the open section of the greenhouse trying to save whatever I can of the bed. 2 of the 6 Roma plants are broken through the main stem. I cut them free and set them aside for composting. The other 4 are bent but not severed. I tie them back upright using strips cut from a cotton shirt I've been saving for bandage material. It'll rot on the stems eventually. 2 weeks from now I'll find something else. The greenhouse frame shudders with each gust. I check the anchor bolts along the east wall. 2 have pulled partway out of the roofing membrane. I reseat them with the last of the tube sealant I've been rationing since June, pressing it in with a folded piece of card and holding it down for a slow count. The sky is grey, and the buildings across the street are dark. The condo tower to the west, the glass one, 22 stories, has light showing in 4 of the upper windows. It's had light in those windows for the past 3 weeks. I've been watching it. I drag Ray Dunbar clear of the bed and position him against the parapet again. I need to find something to weight him with, something that won't blow. There's a bag of rock grit from the maintenance room that I've been using for drainage adjustment. I carry it over and set it across his legs over the tarp. It's not a dignified arrangement. I note his name in the log I keep on the inside of the utility cabinet door. Property inspector, Ray Dunbar. That's all I know about him, and that's all I'll ever know. I've been on this roof since the end of March. Before that, I was in my apartment on Olive, watching what was happening on the street below and not understanding most of it. Not many people did, not at first. The first signs in Seattle were what I imagined they were everywhere. People who seemed sick, but weren't behaving the way sick people normally behave. Not lying down, not asking for help. Moving toward sound, moving toward people. The city health alerts called it a viral encephalitic event and told residents to stay home and avoid contact with anyone showing symptoms. Those alerts lasted about 4 days before they stopped coming. I worked a double shift at Wexler's on a Friday in late March, came home just before midnight, and stood on my balcony watching the intersection 2 blocks down, where a city bus had rolled into a phone pole. There were people around the bus who weren't helping the driver. They were standing with their backs to the wreck, facing outward, turning their heads toward any noise from the street. I went inside and locked the door and didn't sleep. By morning, there were 3 of what I'd started calling the sick ones in the parking structure across the alley. They moved towards sound. A car alarm 2 blocks over would bring them out into the open, heads turning, following the direction. A dropped bottle in the alley would set them moving. They weren't fast, but they were consistent. They didn't stop to check if the source was real. I had a balcony garden at the time. Fabric pots, mostly tomatoes and peppers, a few herb containers. I'd been doing it for 3 years. I'd read enough about soil chemistry and container growing and yield cycles to know the basics, even if I'd never done anything serious with it. Standing on the balcony watching the sick ones in the parking structure, I started making a mental list of what I had, what I needed, and how long I could stay in the apartment before running out of either. I lasted 11 days in the apartment. Then a group of people on the street tried to force their way into the building looking for supplies. 2 residents on the 2nd floor had already turned and were in the corridor. The resulting noise brought more in from outside. I left through the building's roof access with a duffel bag, a kitchen knife I'd been meaning to buy off the owner at Wexler's for 2 years, and the seed packets from the balcony containers. I took the seeds last. I almost didn't take them at all. Later I was glad I did. I crossed 2 rooftops before I found this building. I lost part of my right thumbnail on the 2nd crossing, catching a piece of rusted flashing on the parapet edge. The cuts on my palm from that jump are still visible now, just faded. I pulled myself over the parapet of this building and went through the rooftop access door, and the first thing I saw when I reached the roof was the greenhouse. It was empty. Someone had left in a hurry, or just stopped coming a few broken clay pots, a half bag of perlite that had gone stiff from moisture, a folded trowel, and a coil of irrigation tubing stuffed into a plastic crate. The frame was intact. The polycarbonate panels were mostly clear. The east wall had one cracked panel that someone had taped with clear packing tape, which had dried and was lifting at the edges, but the crack wasn't structural. The roof itself was a standard flat commercial rooftop membrane over concrete, with a low parapet wall on all 4 sides. The greenhouse sat in the southwest corner, where the sun hours were best. There was a utility cabinet on the north wall that had 2 gallons of water treatment tablets, a roll of poly sheeting, and a manual pump sprayer still in its original box. There was a drain pipe in the northeast corner, feeding down the side of the building into the alley. I sat on the edge of one of the empty grow beds and ate the last of what I'd carried out of the apartment, half a sleeve of crackers and a tin of sardines, and I looked at the greenhouse and started making decisions. This wasn't a plan, not yet. It was closer to a recognition. I was looking at something that already existed, and I had some of what it needed, and there was no reason not to try. I've thought about that moment a lot since. I hadn't finished a significant project in my adult life before the outbreak. I'd started a culinary program twice, started a community garden plot once, bought a fermenting kit that sat in a cabinet for 2 years. I was good at starting and bad at following through. What changed on that roof wasn't some personal transformation. It was just that the consequences of stopping were too clear to ignore. The first week was about water. Without water, everything else was theoretical. The building had a rooftop tank that fed the lower floors by gravity, but the main water pressure to the building had dropped to nothing by my 2nd day. Whatever had been keeping the city supply running had stopped. The tank had maybe 40 gallons left when I arrived. I used that for drinking only and put everything else on hold. On the 2nd day, I started looking at the drainage setup. This building has 6 downspouts, 4 on the south face, 2 on the north. The gutters feed into them through aluminum elbows that I could reach from the parapet with a step stool from the utility cabinet. I diverted 2 of the south gutters into a 55-gallon drum I found in the maintenance room on the top floor, rolling it out through the access door and positioning it under the downspout. The connection wasn't clean. I used poly sheeting and 2 hose clamps, but the first time it rained, the drum collected about 30 gallons. I boiled everything before drinking it. The propane burner from the maintenance room had enough fuel to run for several hours at a time. I found 2 more canisters in a storage room on the floor below. I rationed them from the start, boiling in batches, storing in sealed containers, never running a burner longer than necessary. The rain catchment was the only water system I trusted that first month, and Seattle in April cooperated more than I had any right to expect. I made a filter from what I had. 3 layers, a cotton shirt rolled into a cylinder, then a layer of fine sand scraped from a concrete planter on the floor below, then a layer of charcoal from the base of the propane burner's heat distributor. It wasn't a proper filter. I was still boiling everything. The filter was just a pre-treatment, but it removed visible particulate and improved the taste of the roof runoff, which had a metallic edge from the membrane material beneath the gutters. I added 2 more collection points in the second week by running polytubing along the parapet from the north gutters to 2 5-gallon food-safe buckets from the maintenance room. The poly wasn't ideal for long-term UV exposure, but it was what I had. I also started collecting condensation from the greenhouse panels each morning, using a squeegee and a small collector trough I shaped from flashing material. A liter a day on good mornings. Not much, but consistent. And consistency matters more than quantity when you're tracking small reserves. Soil was the next problem. The grow beds had been empty too long, the existing medium was depleted and too dry to work. I needed organic material. I found 2 40-liter bags of potting mix in a ground floor shop that had been a plant nursery. Getting them upstairs without drawing attention took most of a day. I went down through the stairwell in the early morning, moved fast, and was back up before the street activity reached the hour when I'd be visible from the road. The stairwell wasn't clean at that point. There was one of the turned ones on the second floor landing a woman in a green coat who had been sitting against the wall when I first scouted the stairs. She didn't respond to slow, careful movement or footsteps on the far side of the landing. She responded to sudden noise, to voice, to metal contacting metal. I mapped her position and learned to move around her. I used that route for 6 weeks before she stopped being a factor. I got the soil bags upstairs on day 3. I mixed them into the 2 best grow beds, with the perlite from the original bag in the greenhouse. I had seeds, not many. Tomato, sweet pepper, bush beans, lettuce, radish, and kale, all from my apartment balcony stock. I started everything in the warmest bed, closest to the south-facing panels, and covered the seedling tray with poly sheeting at night to hold heat. The germination took longer than it should have. The nights were still cold, but it started. By the second week of April, I had tomato and pepper seedlings with their first true leaves, and the kale had taken in all 3 of the spots I'd direct sown. I moved them to individual containers once they were large enough to handle and started supplementing the grow medium with diluted water from the compost bin, which was active by then, though still early in its cycle. The seedlings were slow. Everything in those first weeks was slow. I learned to wait. I started composting on day 2, before I'd even confirmed the grow beds were workable. Everything organic that I couldn't eat went into a plastic storage bin. I drilled holes in vegetable scraps, coffee grounds from a tin I found in a top-floor apartment, cardboard soaked and torn small, failed seedlings that didn't take, and eventually the spent growing medium from replanted beds. I layered it, turned it every few days with the trowel, and kept it damp but not wet. By month 2, it was producing usable material, dark and coarse, which I mixed back into the beds when I cycled crops. The top-floor apartment units provided more than I expected on the first sweep. Most had been cleared by residents when they left, but 2 hadn't. One had a full pantry that the person hadn't had time to pack. Pasta, dried beans, lentils, tinned fish, salt. Another had a bag of rice, 2 cans of chickpeas, and a bottle of olive oil, 3/4 full. I took all of it upstairs and rationed it from the start. I wasn't going to eat through it in the first month. I was going to make it last until the garden could carry the weight. The garden couldn't carry the weight for the first 2 months. April and most of May were supplement and wait. The kale came in first and was welcome. The lettuce followed. The tomatoes and peppers were months away from producing anything. I ate mostly legumes and kale, and whatever the growing beds gave me, and I was careful about it. I lost about 7 kilograms in the first 2 months. I know that because I tracked my belt holes. The rabbits were a surprise. I found the first one on the roof of the building directly to the north, a brown and white domestic rabbit, probably escaped from an apartment somewhere below when things went sideways. It was sitting near an HVAC unit when I crossed over to check the rooftop for materials. I didn't have a cage. I used a large plastic storage bin with the lid weighted and holes cut in the sides for air, lined with torn cardboard. The rabbit approached the lettuce leaf I held out without much hesitation. It was hungry. I found 3 more rabbits over the following 6 weeks on different rooftops during scavenging runs, 2 more domestics, and one that might have been a cross with a wild cottontail. By June, I had 4 rabbits in a pen I'd built from wire mesh and salvaged timber along the north parapet. They ate vegetable scraps, outer leaves I trimmed from the grow beds, and the hay filling from a stuffed pet bed I found in one of the apartments. Their waste went into the compost, a closed loop. Processing the first rabbit was something I'd never done before. I found instructions in a homesteading book in the apartment with the full pantry. The first time was slow, and I made a mess of it. By the third one I was faster and wasted less. I boiled the bones for stock. I dried the skins on wooden frames in the greenhouse, working them until they were supple enough to fold without cracking. The meat itself was lean and mild, and entirely welcome after 2 months of mostly legumes and greens. The first doe in the pen gave birth to a litter of 6 in early July. I went from having a protein supplement to having a manageable livestock situation. I kept careful counts, breeding pairs, expected litter timing, the growth weights I could estimate by hand. I didn't want the colony to outgrow what the roof could support. 2 breeding pairs, rotating, with the rest processed at 8 weeks. It worked. It kept working. The pigeon problem started in May and got steadily worse through June. They landed on the greenhouse roof, walked along the panel seams, pushed at gaps where the framing met the membrane, and left waste that degraded the polycarbonate and encouraged mold along the joints. More than that, they were drawn to the grain scraps from the rabbit pen and to the fruit on the tomato plants that split in the heat. 3 of them pushed through a gap in the pen mesh one afternoon and ate most of a week's worth of stored hay before I noticed. I strung noise lines, first thin wire with aluminum can tabs threaded on at intervals, stretched across the roof between the parapet posts. In light wind, they rattled. The pigeons ignored them after 2 days. I switched to physical barriers, stringing mesh on a lightweight frame above the greenhouse panels and attaching it with wire ties to the frame structure. That kept them off the panels. For the open roof sections, I used strips of reflective mylar from emergency blankets, tied at head height between the antenna stubs on the parapet wall. The reflective movement bothered them more than the noise lines had. I still lost produce to them occasionally. A split tomato would bring them in through gaps I hadn't patched yet. I patched the gaps as I found them. Pigeon management was never a solved problem, just a managed one. The difference between those 2 things became something I understood clearly on the roof. Nothing in a living system is ever fully solved. You track it, you adjust, and you check it again tomorrow. Ray Dunbar's map had 6 rooftops circled in red. I checked 4 of them over May and June. The first 2 were empty, by the time I reached them stripped of anything useful. One with fire damage along the east stairwell that had charred the access door shut. The third circled building was a small service structure on the north side of a residential block, and inside a partially intact skylight shed, I found cases of bottled water, 8 cases, 16.9-ounce bottles, still sealed. I moved them 1 case at a time, over 3 days, hauling them across 3 rooftop gaps on a rope and board bridge I'd been improving since month 1. The bridge system was the most time-consuming thing I built. Each crossing used a salvaged scaffolding board 12 feet, reinforced with aluminum extrusion bolted to the underside, anchored at both ends, with heavy-gauge angle brackets drilled into parapet masonry. Each bridge took half a day to set correctly. I tested each one with my full body weight 3 times before I used it for materials transport. A plank failure over a 4-story gap was not something I was going to let happen through carelessness. The 4th circled building on Ray's map was the one that changed the long-term picture. It was a small commercial property, 3 blocks north, a former restaurant supply wholesaler, with a rooftop that I'd passed over twice before because the street approach was complex. The rooftop access door was padlocked with a cheap lock whose hasp had pulled partially from the frame. I got it open with a pry bar in under a minute. Inside, professional kitchen storage, 6 10-liter bottles of cooking oil, large containers of dried herbs, and in the back room, On a shelf unit near the emergency exit, a full case of heirloom tomato seeds. 40 varieties, professionally packaged, vacuum sealed in foil envelopes. I sat on the floor of that back room for a while. 40 varieties of seed in sealed envelopes. I knew enough about seed viability to understand that if storage conditions had been reasonable, these were likely good for 2 more growing seasons, possibly 3. I took all of them. I took the oil. I took 3 commercial cutting boards and a large carbon steel skillet that had been hanging on a wall hook. I left the bulkier equipment because the weight and the extra trips weren't worth it. I didn't let myself think about the seeds too much on the way back. I just kept moving. I used Ray Dunbar's rifle exactly 4 times between May and August. 3 times on rooftop approaches when something at street level noticed my movement and started testing the base of the building. Once for a pigeon that got into the rabbit pen and couldn't be driven out through the entry gap it had used. The suppressor kept each discharge to something not much louder than a firm hand clap. I wasn't trained on firearms. I burned 8 rounds, learning my aim on a gravel section of the restaurant supply roof in early May, and then I treated every remaining round as a last resort. By mid-May, I had roughly 60 gallons of stored water in the drum and the buckets. I was using about 3 gallons a day for drinking, cooking, and watering, staying strict about it. The plants needed more than I was giving them, but they adapted. A slightly water-stressed tomato plant concentrates its sugars and produces fruit with more flavor and better shelf life. I hadn't planned that outcome. It was just what happened, but I noted it and worked with it going forward. The lead-acid batteries were a project from late June. Ray's map had led me to a building with 2 salvaged solar panels sitting loose on the roof, disconnected from a dead system. I moved them over 2 trips and spent 2 afternoons wiring them into a battery bank assembled from the lead-acid units inside emergency exit signs, which I'd been pulling from stairwells across the network of buildings I could reach. 3 batteries in parallel, each about 7 ampere-hours. Enough to run a small LED work light for 4 hours. Enough to run the water pump I'd built from a salvaged bilge motor for the irrigation lines. Not enough for anything else, but I wasn't asking for anything else. The wiring work made noise. Metallic, sustained noise tool work, ratcheting connectors, tapping pipe for irrigation layout. Over 2 afternoons I put about 6 hours of that noise into the air above the street. The count of the dead at the base of the building more than tripled by the 2nd afternoon. Warren noticed it and told me in his flat, factual way. I finished the wiring and stopped. The count went down over the next 4 days but didn't return to what it had been. The base of my building was in their rotation now. I adjusted my schedule to avoid peak ground level hours. I first saw them on a Thursday evening in late June when the light was still long and I was working on the pepper bed. 2 figures on the upper terrace of the glass tower to the west, a man and a woman. The man had binoculars. He wasn't making any effort to be discreet about using them. He pointed them directly at the greenhouse roof and held them there for a full minute while I went through the motions of watering. I went inside the greenhouse and counted floors in the tower. 22. The lights I'd been seeing at night were on floors 18 through 21, consistently. 4 floors of occupied, active space in a 22-story building. That wasn't 2 people. That was a group with enough organization and enough surplus to be comfortable enough to watch their neighbors through binoculars from the terrace without fear of drawing attention to themselves. The next morning, I found a piece of corrugated cardboard propped against the parapet of the adjacent lower roof, the building that sat between mine and the tower's service structure. On the cardboard, written in large black letters, with what looked like a permanent marker, "We can trade." Talk? I didn't respond that day. I took the cardboard inside and sat with it for a long time. A group organized enough to communicate this way, and patient enough to wait for a response rather than just coming over, had resources and discipline. They'd also been watching me long enough to understand approximately what I was doing on this roof. The binoculars the night before weren't their first look. I'd just been the last one to know I was being watched. I wrote on the back of the cardboard, "What do you have?" I put it back on the parapet, at the same position at dusk, and went inside. The answer came back the next morning, on a new piece of cardboard, neatly lettered: meds, fuel, tools, security. What do you have? I didn't answer that one immediately. Security was an interesting word to put on a cardboard sign. It could mean they were offering protection. It could mean they were advertising capability. Both could be true at once, and neither interpretation required trusting them. The first face-to-face meeting happened on a Tuesday in early July. I'd built the Southwest Bridge 2 weeks earlier, a 12-foot scaffolding board to the adjacent lower roof, anchored with the same angle bracket system I used everywhere. They had their own crossing from the tower service structure to the same lower roof. We met in the middle. The man's name was Garrett Pells. Mid-40s, heavyset, a short beard coming in patchy on the jaw. Good boots, recently cleaned. He extended his hand when we reached each other on the lower roof, and I shook it. His grip was firm and deliberate, the kind of handshake that's trying to communicate something. The woman with him introduced herself as Adele Crane, late 30s, organized in her movements, with a small notebook in her jacket pocket and a pen clipped to the cover. Garrett told me his group had been in the tower since early April. They'd fortified the upper floors and cut access to the lower building by sealing the stairwells at floor. 14 debris piled and welded with materials they'd sourced from the building's mechanical rooms. He said there were 19 people in the tower. He said they were managing their stored food, but they'd seen my greenhouse from day one and they wanted fresh produce. He said it plainly, without dressing it up. I asked what he meant by security, specifically. He said 3 of his group had military or law enforcement backgrounds, and that they'd cleared their building systematically. He said they weren't looking for trouble. The deal he was offering was this: regular produce delivery in exchange for rotating one person to stand watch on my rooftop stairwell access and keep it clear. He said his group could maintain the lower floors of my building on an ongoing basis if I was willing to work with them. I said I'd think about it. Adele wrote something in her notebook. Garrett smiled in a way that said he was used to being the person in a room who decided when the thinking phase was over. We traded for 3 weeks. I gave them tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, kale, and radishes. They sent a man named Warren Sick up twice a week to stand watch at the stairwell door he was around. 30, quiet, and thorough. Wore a tactical vest with extra pouches and carried a 9mm pistol on his hip. He never came into the greenhouse, and he never spoke to me except to confirm the daily exchange amount. I watched him carefully for the first week and kept watching him carefully for the second week, because nothing had changed that made watching less useful. The produce I gave them was real. A kilo of tomatoes every 3 days, whatever the pepper bed was putting out, lettuce rounds when they reached size. I kept separate beds for my own supply and stayed clear on where the line was. I wasn't going to undermine my own food security to fill someone else's request. Garrett accepted the first 2 deliveries without comment. On the third exchange, he sent Adele's notebook back across with a new item added to the list: herbs. Specifically basil and rosemary. I had rosemary from a cutting I'd rooted in late May, growing in a container on the south parapet. I had no basil, I hadn't prioritized basil seed, and it wasn't in the heirloom collection I'd found. I told Adele this when she came for the 3rd delivery. She wrote it down and said Garrett would appreciate any progress on that. I said I'd see what I could do. I wasn't going to do anything about it. I had no basil seed, and no plans to spend a trip hunting for some when every trip carried real risk. The requests kept growing. By the 3rd week of July, Garrett's list through Adele included a weekly vegetable variety mix, at least 2 fresh herb types, and new on that week's list: protein. He'd heard the rabbits from the lower roof bridge, or seen them from the tower terrace. He wanted 1 animal per week to start, increasing as the colony expanded. That was the moment I understood clearly what was happening. The rabbits weren't part of any agreement. They were mine, the result of 6 weeks of planning, scavenging, and work. Garrett was requesting them as though they were a standing menu item, and I was supposed to be the kitchen. I told Adele the colony was too new and the numbers too tight to sustain that kind of yield. That was partly true. She wrote it down and looked at me with an expression that said she didn't believe most of it, but wasn't ready to push yet. She thanked me and left. July was when the stairwell situation started becoming serious, in a way I couldn't manage around. The alley on the east side of the building had been a draw from the beginning. The narrow gap between my building and the brick wall of the neighboring structure, which I'd been using as a disposal point for anything I couldn't compost and didn't want on the roof, had accumulated months of organic material. In the July heat, the smell from that gap carried 2 blocks. The dead followed smell the same way they followed sound, not intelligently, not with any purpose, but consistently and without stopping. The alley drew them, and they worked through the building's lower entries, through whatever gaps existed in the boards I'd put over the ground floor windows in my first week. The boarding wasn't solid. I'd done it in a hurry with materials I could carry upstairs alone. By mid-July, the first and second floors were compromised. I could hear them in the lobby through the stairwell door, not constant noise, just periodic. The low sound the dead make when they're moving without a specific draw, shuffling, the occasional impact against a wall or door frame, the absence of any other noise. The stairwell itself was still clean because Warren swept it twice a week, but the exits at ground level were gone. I had no way out of this building except across the rooftops. I'd known that was a risk. I'd been building toward it, but knowing something is a risk and living with it closing down around you are different things. By this point I had 3 reliable roof crossings: north to the restaurant supply roof, east to a lower commercial rooftop that connected further east, and southwest to the adjacent lower roof that led toward the tower complex. 3 exits, each one dependent on the bridge being intact and the approach being clear. I ran through the scenarios regularly. They were acceptable, as long as nothing forced a simultaneous problem on more than one bridge at once. Warren appeared on my roof without advance notice on a morning in early August. I was working in the rabbit pen and heard the access door open. He came through it with his vest closed against the morning wind, looked at me, looked at the greenhouse, looked at the pen, and then walked a slow circuit of the entire roof before coming over to where I was standing. He didn't speak until he reached me. He said Garrett had asked him to assess the setup. He said it the way someone says something they've been told to say and have decided isn't worth qualifying. I asked him when that request had been made. He said recently. I asked what recently meant. He said he didn't know exactly. He walked the perimeter of the greenhouse slowly, looking at the grow beds through the polycarbonate panels, checking the anchoring on the frame, looking at the catchment drum. He looked at the rabbit pen. He counted the animals. I could see him doing it, his gaze moving methodically through the pen sections. He walked to the parapet on the east side and looked down at the alley and the street below. He walked to the south parapet and looked at the solar panels. He wrote nothing down. He had no paper. He was memorizing what he was seeing, building an inventory in his head for someone else's purposes. I told him he was welcome to tell Garrett I was happy to talk directly. Warren looked at me for a moment, no expression in it, and then said he'd pass that along. He left the way he came. I stood in the middle of the roof and listened to his footsteps going down the access stairs until I couldn't hear them anymore. Then I went and sat on the edge of the rabbit pen frame and started thinking about the bridge on the southwest corner and how quickly I could remove it if I needed to. The children came across on a Thursday morning in the second week of August. I was in the greenhouse when I felt the southwest bridge flex weight on the plank, the anchor bolt in the parapet post, transferring the movement to the frame. 2 sets of footsteps, light, faster than an adult. I had the machete in my hand by the time the roof access door opened from the greenhouse side. A boy and a girl. The boy was around 11, thin, wearing a grey sweater 2 sizes large with the tower building's logo printed on the left chest. The girl was younger, 8 or 9, holding the boy's hand, looking at the greenhouse with a kind of careful attention that I recognized from the way I'd looked at it myself on the first day. The boy's name was Cody Ruess. The girl was his sister Fern. They'd come across the bridge without telling anyone in the tower. Cody had watched it from his window for 3 days and decided it was safe enough. He'd seen me use it repeatedly. He told me this in a flat, factual way that said he'd been calculating the risk carefully and had made a decision he was prepared to defend. I looked at both of them. Then I went back to what I'd been doing and told them they could look around the greenhouse, but not touch the grow beds. Cody stayed near the door. Fern walked up and down the rows with her hands clasped behind her back, looking at the tomatoes and the peppers and the kale without touching anything. After a while, I asked why they'd come. Cody said they wanted to see the plants. I asked if anyone in the tower knew where they were. He said no. I told him he needed to go back and tell someone before a search started and made noise. He said they'd get in trouble. I said getting in trouble was better than a search party. I sent them back after about an hour, with a handful of cherry tomatoes in a small container, the first batch to fully ripen, dense and sweet. Fern said thank you in a voice that was careful and precise in the way children's voices get when they've been taught to be careful around adults they don't fully know yet. They crossed back on the bridge, and I watched them go. I should have pulled the bridge that afternoon. I didn't. They came back the next day, and the day after that. By the third visit, I'd stopped pretending it was going to stop on its own. Cody was curious in a way that was actually useful. He retained information between visits and asked follow-up questions the next day about things I'd told him the previous one. He wanted to understand how the compost worked. He wanted to understand why some beds were better than others for certain plants. He helped me turn the compost bin and didn't complain about the smell. Fern was quieter, but more observant. She noticed when a plant looked different from the day before: a yellowing leaf, a bent stem, a fruit that had been set since her last visit and was now showing color. She didn't name these things the way someone with knowledge would, but she tracked them. She started leaving small rocks near plants she wanted to check on the next visit, so she could find them again in the rows. I let her do it. They told me things about the tower without intending to. They talked the way children do when they're comfortable and not monitoring themselves. Garrett had run the group well in the early months, assigned roles, created a rationing system, kept security structured. The people who'd arrived in the first weeks had accepted that organization because the alternative was disorder. The people who'd arrived later found a system already fixed and weren't fully inside it. Their mother, Patrice Ruiz, was a nurse who'd arrived at the tower in late June with the children and a medical kit bag she'd carried out of the hospital she'd worked at. The tower needed her. Garrett's rationing decisions were hers to carry out, not to question. Cody mentioned this detail in passing, embedded in a longer story about something else. And the way he mentioned it, neutral, factual, with no editorial, told me that the friction between Patrice and Garrett's decisions was a background fact of daily life in that building. I didn't tell Garrett about the children's visits. I should have. Or I should have stopped the visits. I did neither of those things, and after a while that became a problem that had its own shape. The second face-to-face meeting was in late July. Garrett came alone. No Adele with the notebook. He crossed to the lower roof and met me in the middle with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he didn't extend his hand this time. He said the trade arrangement was valuable, but insufficient. He said 19 people needed more than what he was currently receiving from my roof. He said he'd been patient. He used that word twice, and both times it had the sound of something being held in check rather than something being experienced. He asked what I thought a fair outcome looked like. I asked him what he was proposing. He said what would work was a full and consistent supply of everything the roof was producing, in exchange for his group taking full responsibility for the building's security, the stairwell, the lower floors, the ground level entries. He framed it as a partnership. I asked what my role in this partnership looked like specifically. He said I'd continue managing the garden operation with support from his people. He said the roof would technically remain under my management. That word, technically. I said I needed time to think it over. He said he understood, and that he hoped I'd consider it carefully, because the situation with the lower floors was going to become more difficult before it got easier, and working with capable people was better than working alone. He left without looking back. I pulled the southwest bridge plank onto my side of the parapet that evening, and stored it under the ledge. I wasn't going to leave that crossing open while I was thinking. 3 days after the meeting, Warren came back. This time he had someone with him, a woman I hadn't seen before, broad through the shoulders, wearing work gloves and a canvas jacket with a length of heavy chain hanging off her belt. She walked directly to the rain collection drum when she reached the roof and crouched in front of the downspout connection, looking at the fitting and the seal. I told them both to stop. Warren turned. He said Garrett had sent them to evaluate the roof systems. I said I hadn't agreed to that. He said Garrett believed the last meeting's conversation covered it. I said nothing had been agreed in that meeting. Warren looked at me steadily. The woman with the chain stayed crouching at the drum. I told her a second time to step away from the drum. She looked at Warren. Warren looked at me. He said they would wait while I contacted Garrett directly if I wanted to confirm the arrangement. He said it in the tone of someone making a concession they don't think will cost them anything. I went to the tower side parapet and looked across the gap. 2 people visible on the upper terrace, both looking at my roof, watching what happened next. I came back and told Warren and the woman they needed to leave the roof immediately. Warren held a moment. He said he hoped I wasn't making the situation more difficult than it needed to be. They left. That evening I went through everything I had and made a full inventory. Seeds, the heirloom case plus my original stock, total weight, about 2 kilograms. Tools, hand tool roll, trowel, folding knife, machete, rifle with 12 rounds. Water, main drum, 3 full buckets, 4 cases of the bottled water, approximately 90 liters. Food, about 3 weeks at current use. The greenhouse itself, the compost, the rabbit pen, the growing beds, these things existed in the inventory only as potential because I couldn't carry any of them. Adele came alone 2 days after Warren's visit. She came to the tower side parapet and called across. I hadn't reset the bridge and asked if she could have a word. I went to the parapet. She stood on the far side of the 4-meter gap with her notebook and spoke in the measured, clear voice of someone who has prepared what they're going to say. She said, Garrett wanted me to know the current arrangement was no longer workable. She said the building's stairwell watch would be suspended within 1 week unless I agreed to the full partnership structure. She used the word Garrett had used, released. The stairwell watch would be released. Whatever was currently being managed on the lower floors would not be managed anymore. I asked if she was speaking for herself or for Garrett. She paused. She said she was speaking for Garrett. I looked at her for a moment, and she looked back at me with the expression of someone who has said what they were sent to say and is waiting to see what comes next. I told her to thank Garrett for the message. I stepped back from the parapet and went into the greenhouse and sat down on the cot in the corner. I sat in the greenhouse for a long time. I ate 2 tomatoes and looked at the grow beds. The second planting of lettuce was coming in well. The pepper bed on the south side was putting out fruit consistently. The romas on the second bed had 6 weeks of yield left before the season turned. The rabbit pen had 14 animals in it, the July litter at 3 months, and the 2 August bred does near their time. 5 months of daily work, and all of it was about to go one way or another. I knew I couldn't hold the roof against 19 organized people with weapons, not with a machete and 12 rounds. I'd known that since the second face-to-face, even while I was still telling myself negotiation was an option. Garrett had been patient, because moving before he had a complete picture, risked damaging what he wanted. Now he had the picture Warren's assessment, the tower terrace observations, weeks of watching the operation. He'd done the math. He was done waiting. I needed to deny him what he most wanted, and I needed to do it before he made the next move. The water catchment was the place to start. Stored water in a city with no running supply was almost as valuable as the food production itself. I had a full bottle of pool treatment concentrate, a trichloroisocyanuric acid solution that I'd been dosing into the collection drum in small amounts for sanitation since month 2. A large enough dose in the drum, and all 5 buckets, would render the entire reserve undrinkable without treatment that a group moving in quickly probably couldn't execute. The greenhouse structure itself I couldn't burn. without breathing the off-gas from the polycarbonate panels. But I could burn the compost bin, the dry plant material, and a portion of the growing medium, using the remaining cooking oil as an accelerant, a controlled burn that produced a heavy column of smoke over the roof. Smoke as cover visible from the tower, visible from the streets below, drawing attention and triggering caution rather than immediate movement. It would give me a window. The third decision was the children. That was the one I sat with the longest. That night I broke down the seed collection into 3 portions. One portion went into my primary bag, the one I'd carry no matter what happened. One portion went into a secondary container I could set down if I had to move fast. The third portion I sewed into the lining of my inner jacket pocket, using thread I unraveled from a spare sock. If I lost both bags, I still had a seed supply. It was a small thing to do, but it took 30 minutes, and I felt better for it. Tools went into the bag alongside the seeds. The trowel, the folding knife, the full hand tool roll, the machete on my hip where it always was, the rifle across my back with the 12 rounds in the pouch. I packed 4 days of food, dense, light, mostly dried goods. I packed a second bag from the maintenance room with additional food stores, a water bottle, the emergency poly roll from the utility cabinet, and 2 wool sweaters from the apartments, 1 adult, 1 child-sized. It was August, and the nights were already cooling toward autumn. I reset the southwest bridge the evening before. It needed to be in place before the fire started once the smoke went up. I was committing to the timeline. I tested the plank one more time with my full pack weight. It flexed the expected amount and held. I checked the far anchor bracket on the lower roof side by crossing and back. Everything solid. Late afternoon I went to the tower side parapet and waited. Cody appeared at the upper terrace window at his usual time, just after what he'd told me was the daily meal period in the tower. I held up 1 finger, then I pointed down at the bridge. Then 2 fingers. He watched me. His face was visible behind the glass for a long moment. Then he nodded once. One day, 2 people, come to the bridge. I didn't sleep much. I went through the greenhouse one more time in the dark with the hand torch, walking the rows slowly. The second planting of Romas was 3 days from peak, the skin just beginning to give, when I pressed gently with a thumb. The kale was heavy and dark. The peppers had a full flush of unripe fruit showing green on the south bed, 10 days from red. I stood in the dark greenhouse and looked at all of it. I checked the stairwell at midnight. Quiet from below, directly below, at least. Deeper in the building, 4 or 5 floors down, there was the low, irregular sound that had been there for weeks. The dead moving without specific purpose, filling space. The wedge under the roof access stairwell door was in place. Warren's last sweep had been 2 days ago. Whatever was in the lower building hadn't reached this far. I went to the rabbit pen and sat on the edge of the frame in the dark. The animals were settled for the night. The adults clustered near the hay pile, the July litter at their feet. I'd been running the numbers on the colony since morning, working through whether I could take any of them. 4 adults in the carry bins. The litter loose, it wasn't practical. Too much weight, too much noise risk, too many things that could go wrong on a moving crossing. I moved all 4 adults and the litter into the 2 largest storage bins, drilled for air, topped up with food and water. I moved the bins to the northeast corner of the roof away from the planned fire, protected by the parapet on 2 sides, out of the main path of anyone coming through the access door. Someone might find them. The next people on this roof might think to look in those bins. It wasn't impossible. I went back to the cot and looked at the ceiling of the greenhouse. The polycarbonate panels were dark overhead. The anchor bolts I'd reset in the windstorm 3 days ago felt solid through the frame. The roof was quiet, and the city below it was quiet in its own way. Not the quiet of an empty place, but the quiet of a place where the things moving through it no longer made much noise. I was up before first light. I cooked the last of the rice from the apartment pantry, all of it, the full remaining portion with dried rosemary and a measure of the cooking oil. I ate standing at the propane burner and looked out through the greenhouse panels at the dark buildings around me. The tower had 1 light on in the upper floors, the common area window Cody had described. Someone in there was awake early. At 6, I started on the water stores. The pool concentrate first. I poured the full remaining bottle into the main drum, watching the liquid spiral into the stored water. Then I moved to each of the 5-gallon buckets in turn, dosing them from the secondary concentrate I'd been keeping in reserve. The chemical smell was sharp and immediate. I moved upwind and lidded each container as I finished it. The stored water was gone now. 90 liters of it, fouled. I loaded the compost bin with the additional dry material I'd set aside the night before: cardboard, dry stems, the cotton stuffing from the pen bedding. I saturated the pile with the remaining cooking oil, using enough to guarantee sustained ignition without the risk of a flare. On top of the pile, I set a length of poly sheeting twisted into a slow wick. From ignition to visible smoke column would take about 8 minutes. That was the window. 7:15. I went to the parapet on the tower side. The terrace door on floor 19 opened. Cody came out first, moving fast and low. Then Fern. Then behind Fern and I'd been expecting 2 people, not 3. Patrice Roos stepped onto the terrace, pulling the door shut quietly behind her. She had the medical kit bag on her shoulder, the red cross patch visible from across the gap. She looked across at me and gave a single nod. 3 people instead of 2. I looked at them for a moment, then I nodded back. They descended the fire escape from the terrace to the service structure roof 1 floor below. Cody went first. Smooth and fast, he'd clearly tested that route before today. Fern went second, slower, with Cody steadying her feet from the landing below. Patrice last, the bag held tight against her side, moving steadily. They reached the lower service roof and crossed to the adjacent building's parapet edge in under 60 seconds. I lit the compost wick at 7:22. I watched it catch and begin to burn down through the twisted poly into the pile beneath. Then I shouldered my pack, picked up the secondary bag, and crossed the southwest bridge. 4 seconds across, 4 meters, the plank flexing once at the midpoint. I stepped off onto the lower roof on the far side and kept moving. Patrice was watching from the far end of the lower roof. She tilted her head northeast. The smoke from the roof was already starting. I could smell the chemical edge of the burning oil reaching the compost before I could see the column forming. Cody and Fern were at the next parapet edge, looking at the crossing ahead. Behind me, from the tower, a window opened. A voice, not Garrett, not Warren, shouted something I couldn't hear clearly. Then a second voice from a higher floor. Garrett's voice, raised. He'd seen the smoke from an upper window. The column would be visible from every floor on the tower's west face by now. I told Cody to move. He moved. We crossed 2 more rooftop gaps in about 4 minutes. The north bridge toward the restaurant supply building, then the connecting roof east of it. Both crossings were my own installations, both tested repeatedly. The plank bridges held. Fern crossed each one without hesitating, her eyes forward, her feet placed deliberately. Patrice crossed the second gap with the medical bag pressed flat against her back for balance. 7 seconds across. The stairwell problem hit us at the 3rd building. I'd used this roof as a transit point since May, and the stairwell access had been clear on every prior visit. When I tried the door, it moved about 10 centimeters on a hard push, and then stopped. The resistance was the wrong kind, not furniture, not a fallen object. Weight. Shifting. Passive weight. I told everyone back from the door and put my face to the gap. The emergency light inside was barely active, a faint orange glow on its last battery cycles. In that light, I could see the door was being held by 2 of the dead on the other side, pressed against it by the geometry of the stairwell landing, not responding to the door movement with any active effort. They were there the way water is in a low spot. They'd drifted to that position and had no reason to move. I looked at the alternative crossing a neighboring rooftop to the south that I'd used once and wasn't fully confident about. The parapet on its far side was cracked, and the anchor on the bridge there was a simpler installation than my standard brackets. But it was the only other option from this position. I had Patrice hold the children against the north parapet, out of sightlines from the stairwell door. I pulled the bridge plank from the north, crossing one of my reliable routes, and I was sacrificing it by moving it and dragged it across the rooftop to the south parapet. The far edge caught the opposite parapet with about 30 centimeters of seating. I held the near end firm with my boot on the corner bracket and went across first to wait the landing. Cody second. No hesitation. Fern third, with my hand extended from the far side to take hers at the midpoint of the span. Patrice last, the medical bag against her back, 8 seconds across, and stepping onto the far parapet calmly. We were moving again. Warren found us on the 5th rooftop. I don't know how he moved that fast. He must have used a ground-level crossing somewhere I hadn't scouted, or a route through a connected building I'd never found. He came up through a rooftop access door on the east side of the building we were crossing, breathing hard from moving quickly, his 9mm in his right hand at his side. He looked at me. He looked at Patrice and the children behind me. He didn't raise the pistol above waist height. He said Garrett wanted the roof. He said it in the tone of someone who has been sent to carry a message and isn't fully certain what he's supposed to do if the message doesn't accomplish what it was sent to accomplish. I said Garrett could have the roof. I said the water drum and the buckets had been treated and needed work before use. I said the rabbit pen was in the northeast corner with the animals still in the bins. I said the secondary seed container was under the south parapet wall, the one I'd packed as a drop bag, which I'd left in place deliberately. I told him all of this in a steady, plain voice. It was all accurate. It was also everything he'd want to hear, and I told it in an order that made it sound like a complete accounting. Warren looked at Patrice. He said she and the children needed to go back to the tower. Patrice said they were coming with me. She said it the way a person states a fact they're not going to argue about. Warren looked at Cody and Fern. He held the pistol steady at his side for a moment, then he lowered it. He said Garrett wasn't going to be happy. Patrice said that was Garrett's situation to manage. Warren stood in the middle of the roof for a few seconds. Then he turned and went back through the door he'd come from. I looked at Patrice. She was already moving toward the next crossing. I followed. We came down to street level 2 buildings east of mine. The stairwell in that building was clear. I'd checked it in June, and it had stayed that way, which meant whatever had kept it quiet was still holding. Quiet building, side street, no significant sustained draw from below. The lobby was partially barricaded from the inside, done months earlier by someone who'd left without removing their work. We moved through the gap carefully. The front door was glass and aluminum, and I could see through it before touching the handle. The immediate block was clear. At the far intersection, 2 of the dead visible, both stationary, both facing away from us. We went out and turned east. I knew the next 3 blocks from the scavenging runs I'd done since May. I knew which spots tended to hold the dead and which were quieter and when. We moved through the quieter gaps with spacing between us, not a single noise source, moving at the same pace. Fern stayed between Cody and Patrice the whole way and made no sound. She was very good at that. I'd noticed it in the greenhouse as well, the specific quality of quiet she could hold when something required it. We were 4 blocks east and inside a cleared ground floor commercial space before the sun was fully up. We held there for the rest of the day. Patrice went through everyone efficiently, scrapes from the roof crossings, a bruised knee Cody had taken on the 3rd bridge, a cut on my left palm from a bracket edge that I hadn't noticed in the movement. She used exactly what was needed from the medical bag and nothing more. The children slept in the afternoon on their sweaters against the far wall. Patrice sat near the window and watched the street. I sorted the seed collection on the floor of the back room, each envelope out of the bag and organized by type: tomatoes in a row, peppers, brassicas, legumes, alliums, herbs, the heirloom case intact, all 40 varieties. My original stock intact, the portion sewn into my jacket lining intact. I checked each seal, all of them solid. Ray Dunbar's map was in my inner pocket, still showing the 6 circled rooftops. I'd visited 4 of them, 2 remained. I spread the map on the floor and looked at the 2 unchecked circles. Both were north of our current position, both reachable by rooftop within a day, if the routes were passable. I didn't know what was in them. Ray had circled them for a reason. Patrice came and sat near me in the late afternoon. She said she wanted to thank me for the tomatoes I'd been sending across with the children. I said Cody and Fern had been more useful than they probably knew. She said she was aware of that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me if I'd been doing this growing food for a long time before the outbreak. I said a little. Balcony containers, fabric pots, nothing serious. She looked at what I'd laid out on the floor, the seed collection, the tools, the folded city map, and said it looked like something someone had been doing seriously for years. I said 5 months of doing it every day changes the scale of what you actually know. She pulled a folded paper from her inside pocket. A handwritten list of plant names with growing notes alongside each one in small, clean handwriting. Calendula, echinacea, valerian, elderberry, yarrow, feverfew, medicinal plants. She'd been carrying the list since before she arrived at the tower. She said she'd written it in the hospital on her last shift, in the hour before she decided to leave. She handed it to me. I looked at it carefully. Calendula, I could start immediately from the heirloom collection. It was in there, 2 varieties. The elderberry was going to need sourcing from an established plant, which was a different kind of problem. The others fell somewhere between those 2. I folded the list and put it with the seed collection in the jacket pocket. That night, I found a notepad in the back of the commercial space. A standard legal pad, half used, the remaining pages blank. I sat on the floor and wrote down what I knew, not for anyone specific, just to have it somewhere outside my head. Gutter catchment works at scale with poly sheeting and basic clamps. Don't overthink the fittings. Get the collection volume right, and the water quality follows from filtering and boiling. Compost turns in 3 to 4 weeks in warm weather, with correct layering and moisture. Turn it every 3 days minimum. Lead-acid batteries from exit sign units will run a low-draw system reliably if the panels are matched correctly. Rabbits breed in 3 to 4 weeks and maintain colony size with minimal feed supplementation beyond kitchen waste. Tomatoes in a slightly water-stressed state produce higher quality fruit with better shelf life, not intentional the first time, but repeatable. Heirloom seed viability at room temperature is 2 to 3 years for most varieties if sealed properly. Noise draws the dead. Patience and silence are the primary tools everything else depends on. I wrote, "The greenhouse is gone. The water stores are fouled. The rabbit colony is in the northeast corner of the roof in closed bins, and I don't know what happens to them from here. The grow beds are either burning right now, or Garrett's people are in them pulling tomatoes. 5 months of daily work. I don't have any of that back." I wrote, "I have 2 kilograms of seed. I have the tools. I have a list of medicinal plants I didn't have before today. I have a nurse and 2 children who can learn faster than any of the adults I've worked around in my life. And I have the knowledge from building the first one, what the second one will need, where the mistakes were, what I'd do differently. A second roof greenhouse built by someone who's already run one for 5 months won't take 5 months to reach the same yield. That's not nothing." I put the pad down and looked at the dark ceiling. Cody was asleep against the far wall with his jacket pulled over his shoulders. Fern was asleep with her head on Patrice's folded sweater. Patrice was reading by hand torch, something from the shelves of the commercial space, a catalogue or manual of some kind. The space was quiet. Outside, the city was doing what it did at night, the dead moving through it, without any particular direction, the dark buildings standing over them. The seeds were in my jacket, the tools were in the bag. Ray Dunbar had 2 more circles on his map and I hadn't checked them yet. In the morning we'd start looking for the next roof.